Africa and where we work, and we often get to find out that the patient is diabetic at the time of presenting with acute cardiac event. And we know African people, they can put up with a lot of pain and they don't bother to check themselves prior to having a big event to wake them up. So now let us see how can we handle diabetics in the era of cardiovascular system. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Eric Njinga, who works here in Anaheim, to take us through. The floor is yours.
Thank you, the panelists. So, good morning, everyone. So, my name is Dr. Eric Njinga. I work at the Kano University Hospital. So, we'll go through diabetes and management of cardiovascular risk in the setting of diabetes. So, this will be the outline of our talk. So, we look at the cardiovascular risk that is associated with diabetes. We look at the risk reduction strategies. We look at the specific areas of diet, glycemic control, blood pressure, lipids, and aspirations. And eventually, we come to the second part of the talk, which is looking at the cardiovascular outcome trials and evidence that we have. As we all know, diabetes is the single largest global pandemic in the 21st century. Prevalence around 250 million adults, translating to 1 out of every 11 individuals living with diabetes. So what exactly is the relationship between diabetes and cardiovascular risk? Individuals with diabetes have a threefold increased risk of acute coronary syndrome as compared to non-diabetic individuals. The occurrence of these events occurs 15 years earlier, and they have a twofold increase in short-term mortality, as well as having an increase with regard to events seen in the secondary setting with regard to recurrent ischemic events, post-infarction, heart failure, as well as cardiogenic shock. With regard to diabetes and survival, it is responsible for actually causing a reduction in the average lifespan by approximately 6 years in both men and women from the middle-age years of around 40 to 50 years. And due to this, this generally explains the cardiovascular risk, which accounts for 65 to 70% of all deaths in patients with diabetes, as compared to non-vascular and other causes such as cancer. Diabetes itself is regarded as a significant risk factor for cardiovascular disease. It's a common association, it commonly occurs associated with hypertension, and also it's commonly associated with heart disease. Heart disease in the form of both ischemic and non-ischemic cardiomyopathy, and also the prognosis of heart failure in patients with diabetes is significantly worse as compared to non-diabetic individuals. In the setting of acute coronary syndrome, it's actually seen that close to 2/3 of all individuals presenting with their first acute coronary syndrome will actually have some level of impaired glucose tolerance or diabetes. About 35% of all individuals who actually present their first acute coronary syndrome are known to have diabetes, and 15% are actually known to have newly diagnosed diabetes or previously unknown diabetes. And those seen in these particular 3 trials, the GAMI, the PHS, and also the CSH trial, and you can see the point that we're talking about, close to 2/3 will tend to experience some level of glycemic dysregulation. And why is this very important? In addition to diabetes itself, an independent risk factor, hyperglycemia in itself, in the acute setting of myocardial infarction, is a significant risk factor. So with regard to those who are not diabetic, they tend to get stress hyperglycemia in the setting of an acute myocardial infarction. If their blood glucose value goes above 6.1 in the acute setting, it actually causes 3.9 times higher relative risk of in-hospital mortality. Patients who are diabetic, any blood glucose value more than 10 millimoles per liter confers a 70% increased risk of in-hospital mortality. And then again, we know that diabetes is the single significant risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And as in this term, diabetes is classed as a coronary heart disease equivalent. But this is not entirely true, it has to be qualified. And for it to be relevant, it's the duration of diabetes that's actually crucial. So any individual having a prolonged duration of diabetes, more than 15 years, once you have more than 15 years duration of diabetes, the risk for the next coronary event or any cardiovascular event is actually seen to be equal to an individual who has no prior MI and is not diabetic. So that means the duration of diabetes specifically, a duration of 15 years, and that makes this particular point of diabetes being a cardiovascular heart disease equivalent. So let's look at some of the interventions that you can actually go through. One is medical intervention. This particular trial was actually released back in 2013, the Look-HIGH trial. We're actually trying to look at the effects of intensive lifestyle in people living with type 2 diabetes. There are 10-year follow-up period, and what was actually seen with all the parameters, weight, physical fitness, circumference, and glycemic control, was actually significant improvement, just solely attributed to the effects of intensive lifestyle and diet control in patients with type 2 diabetes. But sadly enough, this did not translate to an improved outcome in terms of mortality. So despite there being changes in all those individual parameters, which should confer a benefit in terms of cardiovascular risk reduction, this was not seen in the setting of people with type 2 diabetes and obesity who are not to the intensive arm of this particular trial. Let's go to glycemic control. And this goes way back to the first landmark trial, the UTPDS, that showed that as little as a 1% drop in HbA1c confers significant benefits in all diabetes endpoints within macro and macrovascular complications. So it was clear that intensive glycemic control does give us benefits, but the question is, how low should we actually go with regard to getting a specific HbA1c target? And then in the next phase of trial, I tried to address this question by actually having a specific HbA1c target. And there were some, like they are called, which had a lower HbA1c target. And a very aggressive approach was actually used, and they tried to get to a HbA1c of 6% in the shortest time frame possible. And what did we learn from this? They all showed in the short term period of the trial bring about reduction in cardiovascular benefits, but with regard to cardiovascular benefits, they seem to be neutral. And only the DCT and UKPDS trial showed cardiovascular benefit, but eventually, if you are aggressive with regard to HbA1c lowering, as shown in the accord trial, the mortality is higher, and the trial was prematurely stopped. So therefore, hypoglycemia is not as innocuous as it looks. Each episode that the patient gets for hypoglycemia, the patient is exposed to significant risk of any outcome in terms of cardiovascular death, microvascular complications, myocardial infarction. All those outcomes actually worsen with each successive hypoglycemic episode that they actually get. And the more recurrent hypoglycemic episode an individual gets, the higher the risk for subsequent episodes and the higher the risk of mortality. So therefore, control of risk in diabetes becomes a delicate balancing act. You want to get optimal glycemic control where you actually have the benefits of cardiovascular risk reduction and microvascular events. At the same time, you don't want to be too aggressive that the effect of aggressive HbA1c lowering now exposes your patient to the effects of hypoglycemia, which is increased untoward cardiovascular risk. The blood pressure lowering arm of the UKPDS also showed immense benefit with regard to lowering of all endpoints, micro and macrovascular complications. And the same was seen in the advanced trial, where we had the BP lowering arm where they used perindopril and indapamide in comparison to placebo, and we had a 14% relative risk reduction with regard to all-cause mortality. The follow-up trial, advanced, also showed significant benefit with regard to all-cause mortality and cardiovascular death. With regard to lipids, we've had the review of the guidelines of 2013, which now propose at least all patients with diabetes with more than one risk factor will benefit at least from a moderate intensity statin. But any individual with diabetes with an atherosclerotic cardiovascular risk of more than 7.5% benefits from a high intensity statin, or any diabetic patient who already has cardiovascular disease in the form of stroke, myocardial infarction, or peripheral vascular disease. And this was demonstrated by the CARDS trial, which had a 10% reduction in terms of primary prevention in people who are diabetic with more than one risk factor, 48% reduction in stroke, and 15% reduction in fatal MI. With regard to looking at a high-intensity statin strategy, there was actually benefit shown for people who are diabetic with advanced cardiovascular disease, for example, stable coronary artery disease, and the 25 relative risk reduction with regard to the events of major cardiovascular events. The next thing is aspirin. Another consensus is any patient with diabetes of low cardiovascular risk will not benefit from aspirin. So the role of aspirin is in the secondary preventive strategy, where you have an individual who has diabetes and evidence of cardiovascular disease, or an individual who is diabetic, male more than 50, female more than 60, with a multiplicity of risk factors. Adults will benefit from aspirin. But you must always weigh the risk of bleeding versus the potential cardiovascular benefits. So it's a delicate balancing act as well. And putting all this together, we have to look at the effects of multifactorial intervention: optimal glycemic control, optimal blood pressure control, optimal lipid management, lifestyle intervention, smoking cessation, and all this was seen in the STINO2 trial, which showed putting all these factors together, you get a combination of at least 50% reduction in all cardiovascular events. And this seems to be 20% high if you look at in comparison to individual risk factor reduction. And again, the follow-up of this particular trial was published this year at a 21-year follow-up period. They actually showed that there was a 7.6 gain in life years for these individuals who had all these multiplicity of risk factors addressed during the follow-up period of the trial. So definitely address all of them together, glycemic control, BP, cholesterol, drugs, exercise, and smoking cessation altogether. So we now come to the next phase of the trial. Next phase of the presentation, where we're looking at the cardiovascular outcome trials. And we'll now look at some of the history. Initially, we started off knowing from way back, the UKPDS, that some drugs like metformin in the initial UKPDS trial and the 10-year follow-up did show benefit with regard to reduction in myocardial infarction, all-cause mortality, and any diabetes-related endpoint. So this was known way back when, during the UKPDS trial. And again, we had the proactive trial which came out with pioglitazone and also showed, with regard to the secondary composite endpoint of non-fatal and minor stroke, we had a 16% relative risk reduction. But there was no benefit in terms of the primary composite endpoint. And this was back in 2005, and we don't use pioglitazone much in terms of diabetes care today. And specifically with regard to cardiovascular risk reduction in high-risk patients, pioglitazone may not be of benefit in terms of people who have heart failure, which is advanced, because it causes fluid retention. So it's not a drug that you don't use in the setting of advanced heart failure. But the other thing is that you want to not use pioglitazone because the glycemic efficacy of pioglitazone takes around 3 months before it's actually experienced within the patient. And they've already seen that in the following an acute myocardial infarction, acute stroke, that period of hyperglycemia, if it's allowed to prevail for a prolonged period of time, it does cause worsening mortality. So it's not a very efficacious drug in glycemic lowering, and there's the effect of fluid retention. That's why we don't use much of pioglitazone today in clinical practice. But back in 2008, it now became mandatory that all oral hypoglycemic drugs coming into the market had to satisfy cardiovascular safety. And the FDA made it a mandate that for the drugs to be licensed, they must demonstrate at least non-inferiority to placebo to show that they're safe. And this gave rise to a multiplicity of trials, which are currently, some have been concluded in the DP4 trials, some are ongoing, and some will actually be concluded around 2019. So we now have all these trials which are currently, some are released recently. We have results from at least the DP4 trials, the leader Empiric trial, which we'll look at shortly, but the rest we're still waiting for the results. Some will be released next year, and some in 2019. So let's start off with regard to the transition of how we actually got here. So with regard to the DP4 inhibitors, the first trial that we actually look at is the examine trial, which looked at the effects of allogliptic in the setting of an acute myocardial infarction. For the primary and secondary endpoints, it was shown to be non-inferior to placebo. So from a cardiovascular standpoint, it was a drug that was deemed to be completely safe in comparison to placebo, but no benefits in terms of reducing cardiovascular risk. Then we have the SAVO-TIMI53 trial, which from a cardiovascular standpoint in primary composite events did not show any increased risk of cardiovascular events, so non-inferior to placebo. But the main thing that this trial actually caused a lot of debate is that in one specific outcome, the secondary composite outcome of increased hospitalization due to heart failure, it actually showed statistical significance with saxagliptin. And this again generated a lot of debate as to whether there's an inherent negative heart failure symptom that was not previously known among the DP4 inhibitor class. So was this a class effect, or was it an effect just purely that was attributed to the drug saxagliptin itself? And that's when now the TACOS trials, the results were weighted upon with bated breath. And now what they actually looked at again was to try and prove cardiovascular safety, non-inferiority, and with regard to the primary composite outcome and the secondary outcome, again it was shown to be non-inferior to placebo. But the biggest question that we were looking to answer was whether it would actually cause an increased incidence of hospitalization due to heart failure. This was found to be negative, did not reach statistical significance. So at least we knew that this was now not a class effect, but it was probably due to the effect of saxagliptin. And if we go back to the trial, why exactly do those individuals have that particular increase in case of heart failure? Number one, those individuals in a baseline, without subgroup analysis, had a higher baseline NT-proBNP. Number two, if you look at the creatinine clearance, it was actually much lower as compared to the other people who would not get this particular complication. So the creatinine clearance was predominantly below 60 minutes per minute. They had a higher baseline NT-proBNP and also the higher age. Again, the HbA1c cut that was used in the SAVO-TIMI trial was more, had a wider range from 6.5 to 12%. Whereas in TACOS, it was a more refined group with a HbA1c cutoff between 6.5 to 8. So again, those could be some of the factors that could have been confounding. We look at them as confounding factors. But we wait to see the long-term follow-up for this particular trial to see whether it's actually true. In the examining trial, there was a trend towards increased heart rate hospitalization, but the post-hoc analysis of the trial eventually disputed that completely. So again, it's good to look at some of the baseline characteristics and judge that. And eventually we got to the point when, for the first time in our field, we're able to have drugs that now showed cardiovascular benefit, meaning that they actually brought about a reduction in cardiovascular risk. And again, this was again a non-inferiority trial, initially with regard to its design, but was potentially designed to actually pick up superiority if it happened to occur by chance. So for the primary composite outcome, it did show a benefit, it was significant. For the secondary endpoints, not much in terms of any benefit, but it definitely was non-inferior to placebo. Looking at specifically hospitality to heart failure, this was found to be, as a secondary outcome, to be statistically significant. But for the primary, definitely that's where the big result that we're looking at, where that is shown. And again, we then had the release of the leader trial, which actually was released last year. Here we used liraglutide, starting off at a dose of 0.8 up to a dose of 1.8 milligrams in comparison with standard care. And the main primary outcomes again, and secondary outcomes were as listed, just like all other trials that we had. And what it actually showed is that at least for the primary composite outcome, it was actually a 13% relative risk reduction of cardiovascular disease in these particular patients. Looking at other outcomes in terms of cardiovascular death, 22% reduction, non-fatal myocardial infarction, 12% reduction, non-fatal stroke reduced by 11%. Expanded MACE, looking at all the outcomes put together, collectively 22% reduction, and the specific outcome of hospitality to heart failure, 13% reduction was actually seen, and for all-cause mortality, 15% reduction was actually seen. So let's now put a head-to-head comparison between these two trials, Metabolic versus the leader trial. What do we actually note? The key thing to actually note is that with regard to both the Metabolic and the leader, there is cardiovascular risk reduction as a benefit. But just look at where the graphs begin to separate. In the Metabolic trial, it begins very early, at around 3 months. But in the leader trial, this actually begins at roughly around 10 months. Why this occurs, we cannot explain it definitively, but we know the drugs have different mechanisms of actions, different sites of actions, and different cardiovascular effects. So we may not be able to fully understand when this exactly happens, but these are two completely different drugs. But we'll try and see with regard to why these effects are getting to need longer follow-up must be decipher why this separation does not occur early in setting of the leader trial. What was actually clear to do a head-to-head comparison was the incidence of non-fatal stroke, which was actually seen to be slightly more in the Metabolic arm as compared to the placebo arm. The only advantage that we did not reach any statistical significance, but in the setting of the leader trial, it was definite benefit that was shown among all the outcomes that were actually seen with regard to the secondary composite outcomes. Again, the reason as to why this occurs, we're not exactly sure, but the good thing that we did not reach statistical significance with regard to the comparison between the two drugs. So why are these molecules beneficial from a cardiovascular perspective? Well, there's the two. One, they bring about a reduction in blood pressure because osmotic diuresis, reduction in intravascular volume, reduction in arterial stiffness, also reduce the effect of the sympathetic nervous system, therefore reducing myocardial oxygen demand. They decrease weight and visceral adiposity, thereby causing an increase in insulin sensitivity, and eventually, also at the level of the myocardium, they reduce oxidative stress. With regard to the lipids, they cause an increase in HDL, decrease in TGs, but this a slight increase in LDL that is actually seen. And of course, uric acid itself is an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease. If you're able to reduce that, that is actually beneficial. But more important, with regard to the GLP-1, again, if you look at the effects at a cellular level, increased inflammation, apoptosis, cardiac and vascular function, and endothelial dysfunction are all reduced, which eventually leads to a reduction in hypertension, atherosclerosis, and cardiovascular disease. And also, this also translates to a reduction in regard to heart failure and intrinsic myocardial infarction. Intrinsic myocardial infarction is improving, therefore causing a reduction in cardiac involvement. So in summary, we're at a point where we can actually tailor our diabetes care to actually cater for cardiovascular risk. People with diabetes are high risk for cardiovascular disease. Now we can actually use drugs that actually target the various facets with regard to the pathophysiology of type 2 diabetes. We can target weight loss, we can target beta cell regeneration, we can actually target effects such as delayed gastric emptying, reduction in hepatic glucose output, reduction in satiety, and all these put together in combination with reduction in cardiovascular risk. So you can actually combine several drugs together to try and achieve the effects. And one thing that we'll be eager to know is, for example, if you're able to combine SH2 inhibitors with GLP-1, are you going to get a cumulative reduction in cardiovascular risk that is yet to be determined? That's what the trial is actually looking to try and answer that question. We'll also await the release of the other SH2 inhibitor trials, like the canvas will be out in 2018 and some in 2019, to actually give us more information with regard to this class effect or is due to specific molecules. Looking at GLP-1 specifically, we had the trial Elixir, which did not show any cardiovascular benefit despite it being a GLP-1 analog. So again, we need to have other trials in this to try and see whether this can be replicated in all other drugs in that particular class. Also, again, of importance with regard to SGLT2 inhibitors, if you look at the precise effects within the myocardium itself, is that they actually tend to cause, due to the fact that they induce a caloric deficit through inducing polyuria, this will actually cause increased metabolization of lipids within the skeletal muscle system, which will now lead to a reduction in visceral adiposity, reduction in weight. But the benefit is, at the level of the myocardium, we no longer have lipids being delivered to the myocardium as the preferred fuel source. The myocardium now shifts to metabolizing glucose, and more importantly, because it causes an increase in glucagon with a reduction in insulin to glucagon ratio, you now have an increase in ketone body delivery to the heart. So it's presumed that those ketone bodies, when they're delivered to the heart, they form a more efficient fuel source when it's actually metabolized by the heart. And that will reduce myocardial oxygen demand. It actually causes a reduction in oxidative stress because now you no longer have lipids, which once they are oxidated, they actually cause free radicals are produced, oxidative oxygen species, which cause endothelial dysfunction and other cell damage. So it's the ketone bodies that are presumed to actually bring about a beneficial effect in the setting of SH2. But again, these ketone bodies are what actually make you be very careful in the setting of individuals who may be type 1 or individuals who are lying in between type 1 and type 2, individuals who have latent autoimmune diabetes of the adults. Young onset of diabetes, maybe in their 20s and 30s with positive antibodies, you may be a bit cautious about giving SH2 inhibitors. The issue about increased incidence of genital infections, it is there, but it does not reach statistical significance in the clinical trial. So again, judge the patient you're going to give these drugs to. So for example, if you have an elderly diabetic female, a risk of UTI is very high, you may want to avoid that individual. Any individual who has a recurrent history of UTI, for example, females more than UTI episodes per year, you want to avoid SH2. So as you tailor your therapy, also look at the risks that are involved.
Very good. Eric, that's a good one. Very good, although most of it went straight over the top of my head. Now, if there is any burning question, we can take it now. Anybody has any point to make for Eric before he leaves the stage? Yeah?
Thank you for the very informative presentation. My question is, when you compare Empiric and LEADER, how do the numbers needed to treat and number needed to harm compare between the two trials?
So, okay, I'm not sure of the precise exact numbers themselves, but definitely there's benefit in the two arms that were actually shown. With regard to just specific outcomes, if you look at primary composite outcomes, the two are actually beneficial. I'll have to check up the number of treat. I'm not exactly sure that, so I'll have to check up and then tell you that later. But there's definite benefit. The only thing that if you do a head-to-head comparison, what is significant is the issue of just non-fatal stroke, but it did not reach statistical significance. But for the exact numbers that I'll have to check with you.
Okay. One more question.
Maybe you can comment on the use of empagliflozin in a patient who has CKD. Is there like a cutoff in terms of the EGFR that you should not use it?
So for these particular drugs, one, their primary mechanism of action is actually based on having a healthy kidney. So the moment you progress towards CKD stage 3, 4, 5, then now the efficacy of these drugs significantly reduces. So with regard to the drugs specifically, empagliflozin is seen to be the best because it allows you to use the drug after a creatinine clearance of 40, 45. But anything below 45, the drug is no longer efficacious, so you have to consider not using the drug. Although the clinical trial, they did actually go as low as an EGFR of 30 mL per minute. But definitely, what is recommended that anything below 45 will not have any significant benefit from this particular drug. Now, if you look at another drug like dapagliflozin, which you currently have in the market, its cutoff is actually more stringent. So they actually say use without any restrictions up to a creatinine clearance of 60 mL per minute. But the moment you hit 60 mL per minute up to 45, they say use with caution. Anything less than 45 completely contraindicated. Canagliflozin use the same cutoff as empagliflozin. So again, creatinine clearance less than 45, efficacy of the drug significantly drops. Because you have to have healthy hepains for the drug to actually act as a proximal treatment to give you these beneficial effects of SH2 inhibitors.
Okay. Your turn.
Yes, Eric, that was a very nice presentation. Maybe 2-3 short comments, stroke questions. One is the attempt to do a head-to-head comparison between Emperor and Leader. That is slippery ground. You really never compare two trials because the circumstances are different. Two, which is probably more of a question, is the DPP4 inhibitors and GLP-1 address the same mechanisms. One by inhibiting an enzyme that whatever, and one that is an agonist, sort of like ARB and ACE inhibitors. Mechanistically, do we have a real reason why the DPP4s are cardiovascular neutral and GLP agonists are positive? And finally, the SGLT2. The reduction in cardiovascular events was significantly driven by a reduction in heart failure, which happened within a very short period of time. To what extent was this a diuretic effect?
So, good comment. Definitely, you can head-to-head comparison definitely cannot be made. Like I said, the mechanisms of actions are completely different. The sites of action of these drugs are completely different, and their cardiovascular effects are different. And you just want to try and make an estimated comparison between the two, but you cannot compare head-to-head because it's a capsule of the trial and all these other factors in keeping will not allow us to do that. So look at DPP4 inhibitors and GLP-1 analogs. So true, the DPP4 inhibitors should upregulate the level of GLP-1 so as to try and give you a cardiovascular benefit. But this may not, all the DPP4 inhibitor trials are neutral from their perspective. GLP-1 itself and liraglutide showed benefit itself. So all this with regard to the proportion of GLP-1, which is actually actively circulating within the body, actually causing some of these cardiovascular benefits. So even if you upregulate by preventing breakdown of GLP-1, maybe the levels that are within the system are not as high as exogenous GLP-1 which is administered, which will now go and actually bring about confound effects, especially at the level of the cellular level and the myocardium, bringing about a reduction in apoptosis, cellular injury, endothelial dysfunction, and all these other beneficial effects of GLP-1. So the other thing also with regard to SH2 is that the effects, like we said, separation was seen very early in the graph. And of course, osmotic diuresis is a major driver of how these drugs actually work. So this, the one, if you lose more fluid and have a reduction in intravascular volume, it will cause a reduction in blood pressure itself. Of course, there's an added advantage of minimizing arterial stiffness, which will again lower your blood pressure. So these effects can be seen quite early, but again, the osmotic effect is actually a significant contributor to this. And again, why this is very, very relevant is that you also have to be extremely careful of SH2 use in elderly patients. Because of this profound osmotic effect, which is seen very early in the course of taking these drugs. People who are elderly exactly can be seen to be an increased fracture risk. And what are some of the main mechanisms why the individuals are having fractures? It's not due to a metabolic effect, but it's simply because of
waking up.
Simply because of
Waking up. Yeah. Waking up at night to.
Not exactly. Let's think about it. Let's think about it. So that was one of the concerns that actually raised by the FDA with canagliflozin. So the drug canagliflozin in Wakanda had a recent FDA warning with regard to an increased fracture risk. The predominant mechanism is what Professor is alluding to. These drugs cause significant osmotic diuresis, reduction in intravascular volume. If you have an elderly patient who is already on antihypertensive agents, has heart failure, you can actually lower them from their baseline. If you're already at 160, 90, 60, and you give them this drug, within a short period of time, they can drop to blood pressure values of 70, 50. And what happens? They fall and they're already at risk of, they have increased risk of osteoporosis, so fractures occur. So again, another concern. So be very careful with regard to the use of these drugs in elderly individuals on antihypertensive therapy with some degree of heart failure.
I think we'll have to leave it at that for now. Thank you very much, Eric. And then we go to hypertension, introduction of the effects of hypertension in Africa. He is the president of East African Vascular Section. He's going to tell us all the secrets about how to manage hypertension in Africa in 20 minutes.
Yeah. Thank you, Awad. Awad is a colleague in the PASCA executive, and he is hosting us for the next PASCA conference, which will be in Khartoum in October, so you are all invited. I was asked to talk about management. Let's see. I was asked to talk about managing blood pressure in Africans in 20 minutes. I hope I'm going to do that. But as you can see there, I've added in Africa and put that in capital, because if you talk about Africans, which of course is derived from Africa, Africa means many things. I mean, it's a geographical entity. It can be an ethnic entity. So somebody with my color, even if he lives in Antarctica, is still African, isn't it? It can be a geopolitical issue. If you are a member of the AU, you are African, isn't it? And it can have a socio-economic construct. So I'm going to look at this from the point of view that the reason we are talking about managing blood pressure in Africans and in Africa is that there are certain specific peculiarities within Africans or in Africa. My talk is going to be a little bit more biased towards public health and health systems. As you heard yesterday in the meeting yesterday when we were talking about STEMI, we were not talking about choosing what type of stent and, it is about systems. Because unless you have systems, all these other things are useless. So probably, and I apologize in advance because many of you are clinicians and the clinical scenario is your comfort zone. But this is deliberate. We have to get you to think public health, because if you don't fit the systems, all these things we know don't mean anything at all. In terms of disclosures, really nothing about with respect to this talk, but maybe because some of these initiatives that I'm involved in, the PASCA hypertension roadmap, the Creole study, Healthy Heart Africa that I'm going to talk about, so maybe there's an inherent bias there. In terms of outline, we're going to very briefly just remind you a bit facts you probably know about the prevalence of the burden of hypertension globally and within Africa in terms of both prevalence and in terms of the consequences. And then spend a little more time talking about what I think are the peculiarities of hypertension in Africans, especially those living in Africa, okay? And in terms of severity, pharmacogenetics, health systems, and refer to a few of those initiatives that many of us are involved in to try to address these issues. This is a slide that says many things. I like it because it's a good summary. First, the worldwide prevalence of hypertension is about 40% of adults. So actually it is estimated that the current prevalence of hypertension in the world is about the number of hypertensives in the world currently is about 1.6 billion. So that's somewhere between the population of India and China. So it's a massive number. And much more importantly, because that is just a number, is that hypertension causes approximately 13% of all deaths in the world. If you look at cause of death by risk factor, then hypertension is the commonest cause of death in the world. And about 4% of that is. And if you look at cardiovascular death, which of course is the commonest cause of death in the world, then hypertension is responsible for about 40%. So the burden is there, so we are justified in talking about it. The good thing is that if you treat hypertension adequately, mainly by pharmacological treatment, and we'll address pharmacological treatment briefly, but not very much in this particular lecture, that in fact, we can do a lot of good. And this is a meta-analysis that involves hundreds of thousands of patients. You can see there is more than 200,000 that was published in 2000. That in fact, the risk reduction in terms of heart failure is more than 50%. the risk reduction for stroke is somewhere within 30–40%, which reflects very closely what was predicted from epidemiological studies. The risk reduction in myocardial infarction is significant, but is less than, in fact, what had been predicted from epidemiological studies. The sad story is that despite the fact that if we treat, we do a lot of good, globally we are doing a very poor job of treating. And it is worse in Africa. And that's why I'm focusing on that. Because it doesn't matter how effective our modalities are, if we don't deliver them, it doesn't make a difference to your patient. Sorry. So, getting to Africa, this is a slide that those of you who have listened to me many times talk about hypertension. I talk about hypertension so often I bore myself. But this is probably the first scientific paper written out of Kenya. It was published in the Lancet in 1929. Not even me with my gray hair was born. My mother was not born either. So, this was a hostel in the area around Kisumu. That's what the colonialists used to call Kavirondo. And this colonial doctor, over a 2-year period, saw about 1,800 people. And as you can see from that paper, not a single person had elevated blood pressure. The problem more often was low blood pressure. So, things have clearly changed. This is a slide I borrowed from a colleague of mine, Albertino Damasceno, and an Egyptian colleague, Ibrahim, which they published in 2012. And essentially what it shows is using the so-called WHO stepwise survey tool, which I know many of you here who are my students have used in their studies. Several countries, including African countries, have recently done prevalence surveys. I'll show you the Kenyan one. We are a little late, but at least we got there. And you can see Egypt here, 26%. You can see Mozambique, 33%. You can see Eritrea, 16%. You can see Algeria there. So you can see that the prevalence of hypertension in Africa, age adjusted, is somewhere around 25%. And that is for a very young population, because the mean age of most of these surveys is in the 40s. Now, so that's one, high prevalence of hypertension in Africa. Two, I'll take you through this slide. This is a WHO slide. And what it basically shows is the rate in increase in mean systolic blood pressure in populations across the world, which is just another way of estimating the rate of increase of the prevalence of hypertension. And this, the dark color here, represents those countries in whom hypertension is increasing. And you can see what sub-Saharan Africa is. So we have a high prevalence of hypertension, but we also have an increasing prevalence of hypertension. Then we go to the next thing, which is morbidity. I sort of developed this slide out of the Global Burden of Disease database. You can go there and actually make slide the way you like it. So what I basically did is, let me look at Africans in the middle to elderly range. What is the biggest cause of death? And you can see that actually hypertension is already the leading cause of morbidity in this population. And this is backed by data in disease-specific studies that we've done. We know from Interheart Africa that it is the leading cause of coronary artery disease. We know from Thesis that it is the leading cause of heart failure. We know from other studies that is the leading cause of strokes and renal disease. So the prevalence is there, it is increasing, it is already causing disease. This is a meta-analysis that was published in 2015, March, of the then published African studies population surveys about hypertension. And the pooled prevalence is about 30%. And I've not shown the data here because I was told I have to give all this in 20 minutes. But the progressive rise with age is there, so that by the time you reach 50 and above, it is about 1 in 2 people, about 50%. But the more important thing here is that if we take those who are hypertensive as representing 100%, and these are the people who are controlled, which is only 7%. So only 7 out of 100 Africans with hypertension are controlled. Where is the biggest problem? It's lack of awareness. So that only 27% are aware, which means that more than 70% are not aware. Once they are aware, we actually don't do such a bad job of treating them. More than 50% of them are on treatment. Of those on treatment, we don't do such a good job of controlling them. But the biggest problem is here. If you have an awareness rate of 27%, even if you were to reach a control rate of 60%, which nobody has ever done in the world, 60% of 27% is what? Probably 20% is something. That's all you can achieve. So from a public health point of view, because in my language, managing hypertension means reducing the community burden of hypertension-associated morbidity and mortality. It's not how well I control that single individual in front of me in the clinic. So unless we tackle that, then we cannot control the community, the accruable morbidity and mortality from hypertension in the community. So that's the fourth peculiarity I've shown you, isn't it? High prevalence, rising prevalence, high morbidity, poor awareness, treatment, and control rates. This is now Kenyan data. We have a lot of Kenyan data in specific populations. Some of them done by people who are sitting here. Jao did work in Kibera. I think Hassan is around here, he did work in Garissa, and several. But these have been in specific populations. So for the first time we have this, which is Kenyan wine study. We did this in collaboration with the Ministry of Health, with Kemri. It's not published. We negotiated with one of the journals for a special edition where we'll publish like 10 different papers, because this looked at everything from violence to alcohol consumption to everything. But since we are talking about hypertension, just to highlight a few things. One, this figure of about 25%, quarter of the population, age-adjusted prevalence, is pretty consistent across all those studies that we've talked about. And you see the increased prevalence. The first of these, population, reasonable population surveys in Kenya was one done in Nakuru by Madenge, who happens to be an ophthalmologist actually. And she only did it in people who are over 50 years. And she got exactly the same figure, about 50%. So there's some internal consistency among across the Kenyan studies. The other data, which is even more alarming, is that only 15% in our survey, in the STEP survey, awareness of only 15%, so worse than the pooled African data. Treatment rates of just about 8%, so about half of those who were hypertensive are on treatment, and control rates overall of just about 5%. So pathetic, isn't it? Only 1 in 20 Kenyans with hypertension is controlled. So, additional things where we achieve poor control. I mentioned something called the Healthy Heart Africa program, which is a massive program sponsored by AstraZeneca and the PI. We've screened about 1.7 million Kenyans up to now. And as a prelude starting the intervention, because it's an intervention study, we did a baseline survey, both of healthcare workers and the public. And these are some of the things that we asked. Awareness, because if you don't know these things, then you don't know about the significance of hypertension. And for the sake of time, I'll go through it quickly. The good news was that quite a number of people knew something called hypertension. But the bad news there is that very few of them knew it from the healthcare system. So we don't know how accurate this information is. Some of them believe hypertension is when you get palpitations. Some of them believe hypertension is when you have a headache. If we looked at risk factors for hypertension, salt was reasonable. But look at some of these other things. Alcohol is a major cause of hypertension, only 6% of the population. If we look at complications, maybe we don't expect this very much from the general public, but really they should know why you're treating them for hypertension. Now, if we move to the health care workers, and this is more scary, look at that. Physical inactivity, less than 50% of healthcare workers. And the way we went is we went to these facilities and asked the administration that give us the person responsible for hypertension services in this institution. And this is what we came with. I don't have to belabor the point. So, another issue. This is a paper we published with Lois Etienne way back in 2009, looking at the people in the hypertension clinic in Kenyatta National Hospital, and looking at both control and adherence. And this is, at least nominally, we are supposed to be a tertiary hospital. Sometimes we behave like a dispensary. Just illustrating statistics. Even in a tertiary institution, only one quarter control rate. Very poor adherence. Hillboard here is the instrument that we used. And there was a direct correlation. So, poor healthcare knowledge, poor public knowledge, poor adherence. And if you don't, drugs that are not taken don't work in you, isn't it? So, then we now come to the genetics, okay? Well, it's actually not genetics, but what is peculiar about the African hypertensive from various studies. Like I've already illustrated, it occurs very early. Like Njau's study in Kibera. I mean, the mean age of the population was what, 44, something like that? 43. And yet we had an age-adjusted rate of 20-something%. It is often severer. There is more target organ damage which tends to occur earlier. There's more salt sensitivity, low renin status, more vasoconstriction, blunted night dipping of the blood pressure, and as we all know, differential response to pharmacotherapy. So all these are considerations that we have to take into if we want to improve the management of hypertension in the African, especially in Africa. So, coming to the pharmacogenetics, a lot of work has been done, initially beginning from the VA studies in the US in the 70s, that at that time showed there was a differential response to blood pressure drugs, specifically beta blockers. And this study has been replicated in Africa, and actually one of the, we have a publication on that with Professor Yonga way back in '93. So, there's this systemic review which you can look at, is pretty recent, by Y.K. Sidat, who is one of the doyens of African hypertension, working with some colleagues from the University of Amsterdam. And because of time, I'll just summarize what it says. So they looked at 35 trials, 7 drug classes, more than 25,000 patients in the trials. And they looked at trials that addressed efficacy in lowering blood pressure and trials that addressed clinical events. And basically they confirmed what we already know actually, that calcium channel blockers and diuretics in terms of blood pressure reduction are more efficacious than inhibitors of the renin-angiotensin system and beta blockers. And a lot has been made about the nitric oxide donation by nebivolol. And because Africans are supposed to have more endothelial dysfunction, whether this would make it a different blocker, adding nebivolol to the equation didn't make a difference. When they looked at the endpoint studies, and this is good news, there was no difference. It means if you control the blood pressure in an African by whatever means, then the benefit is the same. And the reason there's no difference is because most of these endpoint studies used combination therapy, okay? So you had all sorts of things. So, This now is reflected in how the various guidelines, talk about, recommend the use of drugs in the African population. This is GNC 7, GNC 8, ESX, ESC. What is not here is the so-called ISH-ASH guideline, that is the International Society of Hypertension and American Society of Hypertension. But it pretty much reflects what the JNC 8 says, which says for non-Africans, any of the 4 or 5 major classes of drugs are recommended as initial monotherapy. So diuretics, thiazide or thiazide-like, beta blockers, ACE/ARB, and calcium channel blockers. But if you're dealing with African populations, then calcium channel blockers and thiazide diuretics are the recommended initial monotherapy. Mark my word, monotherapy. So, just a summary of challenges again. High and rising prevalence, low awareness rates, late diagnosis, low rates of initiation, retention, that's another important thing, and adherence to therapy, poor healthcare systems, I've given you some of the data, a more malignant disease, difference in response to drugs, poor control rates. And you have that vicious circle of morbidity and mortality. So, but we can't fold our hands and say, poor Africans, why is God so unfair to us, okay? We have to work on it. And when faced with challenges, you have to be creative, okay? So, the last 4 or so slides, I'm just going to address some of the thinking about how we can tackle it. So this is something that is borrowed from the World Heart Federation roadmap on hypertension and looks at hypertension sort of holistically. You have your population out there. Within that population, there are people who have high blood pressure. You have to identify them. They need to know that they have high blood pressure. The health system needs to know that they have high blood pressure. Then once you identify them so that they know their blood pressure, that it is high, then you need to start treating them. And once you initiate them on treatment, then you have to work on measures that, one, make sure that there's retention in therapy, because hypertension is a chronic problem, and that there's adherence to therapy. And that is what ultimately leads to control. So if you're talking about managing hypertension from a population point of view, what we usually talk about is here. Is valsartan better than losartan? Bullshit. No. I mean, what potential difference would 2 ARBs have that would have a population impact? It's an exercise in futility. These are the important things. So, one of the initiatives is that as part of the response to the 25 by 25 initiative, the World Heart Federation chose 3 targets where they thought there was the most robust evidence for clinical impact. And that is tobacco cessation, secondary prevention after cardiac events, and hypertension. As PASCA, we adopted the hypertension issue and used the model of doing a roadmap. These were proceedings of the first meeting we had in Nairobi. Some of you have probably seen this and the photograph. I removed the photograph from here because we didn't have time. So in summary, in the roadmap, what we are addressing, and we are launching the roadmap in Khartoum in October, is just not which drug controls blood pressure. So we are talking about detection programs. If they are going to be sustained, they have to be funded. You have to have simple guidelines that a clinical officer or a medical officer in a BC clinic, where the next guy has got a snake bite, this one has been hit on the head with a hoe, this one is having peripata or whatever, what is it called? Hemorrhage, all those things. So you have to have simple guidelines that that guy can use, okay? Not whether perindopril is longer acting than tetracycline. Monitoring of our projects, because that is when we know whether we are succeeding or not. integration into care. Okay? We can't afford at health center level to have a hypertension clinic and a diabetes clinic and a whatever clinic. The resources are not there, including the human resources. Task sharing, not shifting. The language has changed. We have to have drugs and equipment. And most of you here are working or have worked in public institutions, and you know what that is. Ultimately, we have to have universal access. I think it's Baraza who said it this morning that most Kenyans are one illness away from catastrophic poverty. It just takes you further having an accident and getting to the ICU in Nairobi Hospital for 3 days, and all your family savings are gone. So universal access is not just a political issue. It is a basic human rights issue. Research, of course, and we have to have population level interventions so that we actually prevent, not just manage high blood pressure. The second initiative is the Healthy Heart Africa that I've talked about. I won't say too much about it, but it is an initiative that, one, aims at educating the population about awareness about hypertension, strengthening the health system, and giving, availing access to drugs at subsidized prices. And it's actually a big project. Those of you who will be in Kenya Cardiac Society, we're presenting 2 abstracts there. Those of you who will be in PASCA, if AWAD and its local organization committee accepts our abstracts, we have 3 abstracts there. And we have 3 abstracts for the European Society of Hypertension in June. So watch this space, you'll be hearing a lot from us. Now, I talked about simple guidelines. This is not from the PASCA roadmap. The one from PASCA roadmap I can't show you yet because I'm not allowed. This is for the HHS study. So you can see that in this one page, we have given the clinical officer a lot of guidelines. They are explanatory notes that they can refer to where they don't understand, but something they can have on the wall or on the desk and look at. And because my friend Awad is beginning to look at me with rather curly eyes, we know that at least 2/3 of hypertensives need combination therapy. So in fact, sometimes when we argue about which drug is better than the other, it's again almost an academic exercise because most of those drugs, if you combine them well, will work anyway. So we know that there is combination. The optimal combination in the African population is not very well known. Most of the combination studies have used either calcium channel block and a RAS inhibitor, or a RAS inhibitor and a diuretic. In the African population, as monotherapy, thiazide and calcium channel blockers work best. Does that mean that then a calcium channel blocker, thiazide combination would be the best combination? We don't know, because nobody has studied it now. And this is the basis of this. The Creole study is a multi-center African study, 8 centers in 5 African countries. In Kenya, we have 2 centers, Kenyatta and Felix Baraza in Eldoret. We are about to start. And essentially, it is a parallel, randomized, single-blind study that is looking at 3 combinations. An ACE inhibitor and a thiazide diuretic, an ACE inhibitor and a calcium channel blocker, and a calcium channel blocker and a thiazide diuretic. We intend to randomize about 800 patients. We'll actually use ABPM, which is another novelty in the study, as the primary, whatever. And again, watch this space, we should have some results for you. And in conclusion, from the 1st of May, and those of you who are in Eldoret, I showed this, there's this initiative of the International Society of Hypertension and World Hypertension League, where we want to check the blood pressure of 25 million people worldwide in the month of May. Kenya is one of the countries that are signed in. I'm leading the process, but we are doing it under the auspices of the Kenya Cardiac Society with the Ministry of Health, and we're starting to measure people's blood pressure, especially those who don't know their blood pressure or have not had it measured. in within the past 1 year. So we looking for all your support, whether it is moral or by prayers or by availing your resources or your time. Any of those will be welcome. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good. Well, you're not letting them in all the secrets then. So if there's any question, we'll take 2 questions perhaps. Yeah.
Thanks, Prof, for excellent. Just in terms of now looking at bringing down the prevalence in our African setting, with the roadmaps being done, what about looking at, from a public health perspective, the impact of things like imposing tax on, we're looking at cigarettes, smoking cessation, or just imposing tax on sugar and salt, which has had a significant impact. I've shown that if you impose tax on both sugar and salt, so in the UK, for example, that should have a significant drop of close to 50% simply by reducing the salt content in bread, for example. So I don't know whether we'll try to ask government to look into that.
We try, actually, we sort of starting with sugar because it's a more malignant thing, because people don't perceive that this safe thing called Coca-Cola or Sprite, which is what respectable village elders and pastors take, can cause death. But of course, you know, it has got the politics of it, the economic politics of it and all that. But these are now the wider population-wide initiatives that I put as the last thing there, where you have to engage ministries, you have to engage other stakeholders. So that what you said is extremely important. In fact, I was just reading, I haven't actually read it, I get these alerts, the number of journal alerts I get in one day I couldn't read in 10 years. So it just sticks there that I saw something. That actually by banning trans fats in New York City, within 1 year we have shown a reduction in the people getting to hospital with acute myocardial infarction. So some of these public things have got very, very significant impact, yeah. Very important point, yes, no?
Thank you very much, Prof. I was actually provoked by the slide on characteristics of the African hypertensive, and there was the fact that we have a lowering status and deep planting, especially at night. What do you advise on control of nocturnal hypertension and timing of the medications for our population then?
Well, let me start with a straightforward answer. We really have no evidence, okay? It is something that has been studied, not specifically the African population, because many people have got this lack of nocturnal dipping. It's worsened by things like obesity and therefore obstructive sleep apnea. So, and we are in the era where most of our medications are supposed to be 24-hour medications. But of course, it's not a flat plateau. It's still that. So, is it better if you put it at night? The evidence is not clear-cut. For me, what I tell my patients is that it depends on what works best for you. And because different people have got different disclosure, I'm hypertensive, for example. What works best for me is if I take it in the morning because I've got a very predictable program in the morning. Because of my lifestyle as a doctor and many other things I don't want to mention, my nights are not predictable. So if I take it in the evening, I miss it. So I think that is probably what is primary, that your patient gets what works for them, something which is a trigger. Is it when they're taking breakfast? Is it when they're brushing their teeth? Is it when they're getting into bed, or that encourages adherence?
Thank you very much, Ali. I think for the sake of time, we have to carry on. An interventional cardiologist of the United Kingdom. He is based in King's College, London. He is going to tell us about dyslipidemia and the journey from the old to new stuff to tackle the problem of dyslipidemia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I've got the joint pre-lunch talk. You'll be thinking about leaving early to fill your stomachs, so I'll keep this brief. No conflicts of interest, but as my kind introduction said, I'm an interventional cardiologist. I'm not a lipid expert. So I'm going to give you a brief overview from my point of view about the current treatments that we have and one or two on the horizons. And I'll take questions at the end. So everybody here knows, I think, there's an overwhelming body of evidence for statin treatment in secondary prevention, in reducing cardiovascular events and mortality. And I'm just going to go over some of the data on the high-risk, intense treatment of statins where we've come to in terms of our guidelines, and just discuss whether we should or can go further with cholesterol lowering, whether there's any additional benefit, and which agents we might be using to do this. So this is a summary slide of really all the major secondary and primary prevention trials, and you'll know that this includes in the order of 70 to 80,000 patients in total. It's a huge body of evidence stretching back to the early 90s. The first study being the 4S study. Yeah, we'll do that. 4S study here, where you have the biggest reduction in events because you have the highest at-risk population treated at fairly high levels of LDL-C, brought down to a modest level here, modest by our modern standards, but with a dramatic impact on cardiovascular mortality. And if you look through the studies over the next 10 years, they're all progressions in the intensity of LDL-C reduction. You probably remember from the 1990s, our normal level of cholesterol was well over 5. So we've come all the way down here. The two studies that are of most importance are in the secondary prevention population, the A to Z study and Prove It, looking at high doses of atorvastatin or high doses of other statins, with a relatively significant LDL-C reduction and a great benefit in mortality. If you look at primary prevention, here the effect is much more modest. And if we're looking at intensive cholesterol lowering in the primary prevention population, we have such a strong evidence base in terms of reduction in cardiovascular events, but it's still worth considering. So really, LDL-C reduction and lowering cardiovascular events we know has a major effect on outcome. These are the two major studies I talked about a moment ago, A to Z and Prove It AMI. And if you look across here, I'll draw your attention to the levels of LDL-C reduction. So that's a baseline moderate intensity reduction of 2.5 millimoles per litre, and an intense to 1.6. So about a 42% reduction here, resulting in about a 20-25% reduction in cardiovascular, in major adverse cardiovascular events, and similarly for the A to Z. Now I just wonder how many of us get our patients to anything close to these targets in current practice, and if you're anything like me, it's a smallish number who get down to these intensive levels of statin reduction. For stable coronary artery disease, again, slightly less intense lipid-lowering regimes resulted in similar but smaller reductions in cardiovascular events. The pleiotropic effects of statins are important, so more than just reducing LDL-C levels, they also cause plaque regression, and we've got some landmark studies looking at this. Again, relatively small numbers, but very, very intense protocols, which is why it's very hard to recruit more than this. 500 patients, aggressive high dose of atorvastatin versus old school pravastatin, which we still use. And this is intravascular ultrasound, volumes of plaque within the coronary tree, showing a small but significant reduction, around 3%. And it correlates with LDL-C reduction. It's all about the reduction in the LDL-C levels. It also correlates with reduced levels of inflammation, and a very sensitive marker of inflammation, CRP, dropped by around 30-40% in this study. So really this is a pleiotropic effect of statins. It's anti-inflammatory, it's anti-atheromatous, as well as reducing LDL-C levels, and that's probably the mechanism of reduction in mortality. Stabilising plaque, stabilising calcified plaque, stabilising soft plaque to become calcified. This is an image showing the intravascular ultrasound in patients with stable coronary artery disease given high dose rosuvastatin, higher intensity than atorvastatin, measured at 18 months. Again, really intensive protocols these with invasive angiography baseline and a follow-up. So pretty small numbers of patients, but if you look at the entire coronary tree, you do see a reduction. It's small but significant in atheroma burden. So this is important data which correlates with our acceptance that reducing LDL-C lowers cardiovascular events. And again, even more dramatic LDL reductions here. 75% of patients below 70 grams per deciliter, that's well below 2 millimoles per litre, and HDL levels increase to a much lower degree. We haven't really seen the evidence for high or increasing HDL levels with cardiovascular outcomes in any of the studies. They've been negative. And if you look at mortality, which is obviously the absolute aim of all of this, to reduce mortality and secondary prevention, you have to put the studies together. Again, around 5,000 patients in these studies, pretty small numbers relatively speaking, but you do see a mortality benefit in patients treated with intense doses of statins, which you don't see in the stable population, and risk reduction around a quarter. But again, with bigger numbers in the stable populations, it's not seen, so you don't see this mortality benefit. And that's partly to do with the event rates in this population. They're much, much lower. It's much, much harder to demonstrate. You would probably need a trial of 40, 50,000 patients, which we're not going to get readily, but even if you meta-analyse all of the primary prevention data, it's very hard to demonstrate anything above a reduction in cardiovascular events. You don't see a mortality benefit. So, do we need anything else? Well, I put it to you that we don't see our patients at these levels. We don't get them down to LDL-C levels of 1.6. It's very hard. There's very, very high rates of tablet intolerance, not just statin intolerance. People don't like taking medication. They don't like taking medication particularly when they can't see an obvious benefit. And statin's an obvious drug that causes a number of muscular side effects and gastrointestinal side effects, some of which are exacerbated by what people think they might develop, and it's definitely the case. And around 30% of patients really are on very little in the way of statins or nothing after a coronary event, and around 50% don't reach these LDL targets. And we tend to put people on 80 of atorvastatin and leave them on it if they can tolerate it, but not all of them will tolerate it. So I think there is a real need for something else to bridge this gap. And we don't see the randomised trial populations. We don't see these very, very closely monitored, intensively monitored patients in the UK. I'm sure you don't here. It's not feasible. So what are the new agents, the PCSK9 inhibitors? Well, they're a specific LDL receptor binding protein. So cholesterol metabolism occurs in hepatocytes. LDL-C receptors transport LDL from the surface of the molecule into the hepatocyte, which is metabolized. So larger numbers of available LDL-C receptors allow more metabolism of LDL-C and reduction. And PCSK9 bind to these LDL receptors and help with their degradation, so they reduce the number of available LDL-C receptors. So if you have more LDL-C receptors available, you can reduce LDL levels more significantly. So that's how they work. It's easier to look at a picture. So here you can see this is the agent, this is the molecule which binds to the LDL-C receptor, which recycles in the within the hepatocyte, metabolized here. So with less of this around, you get less transport of the receptor back to the endoplasmic reticulum and less metabolism, and therefore you get more LDL within your circulation. So that's how they work, that's the idea. This is the proof of concept. So this was early data from 2003 showing that if you have extra PCSK9 production, overproduction, transgenic animals, you get higher LDL levels within the circulation. If you have reduced PCSK9 activity, you get reduced LDL levels. So that was a proof of concept, some very early experimental data, and really this was the clinical correlate in larger populations with familial hypercholesterolemia. Variations in expression of these inhibitors relates to LDL levels. So that's really proof of concept, but there's a big step from here, 10, 13 years ago to clinical practice. And really the first clinical data showing that there was an effect was use of this monoclonal antibody, which is subcutaneously injected, on PCSK9 levels and LDL cholesterol levels. And this showed that if you lost function, you had reduced LDL levels. If you gained function, you had lower LDL, higher LDL levels. So this was the effect of monoclonal antibody, which showed a dramatic reduction in LDL-C levels correlating with this reduction in expression. How are they given? What are the agents used? There are 3 agents here. Don't try and pronounce these. It's not worth it. The key thing is they're given subcutaneously. They're not oral medications. So once every 2 weeks or once every 4 weeks, that's a big deal. So getting patients to take tablets is hard enough, but having an injection once every couple or 2 or 4 weeks is even harder. The data, well, there's a lot of phase 1 and phase 2 studies. That's the early introduction of the drug into the market, smaller numbers, less than 1,000 in each patient, but they show dramatic reduction in LDL-C levels, around 40 up to 40 to 50%. Side effects, relatively few actually. So there is the usual LDL-C lowering muscle effect, but it's quite small, it's around 3%. Really minimal signals of rhabdomyolysis or the sort of adverse effects of high-dose statins. You see odd effects like nasopharyngitis at low incidence in the groups, and also there's some self-reported neurocognitive effects. Now that's not been specified clearly in the trials, but obviously that's concentration, confusion. Interestingly, some of the effects that people complain of when they're on statins, not proven in the randomised trials, but people will often say that they don't feel quite with it on high-dose statins. It's small, but it's certainly something to bear in mind looking forward into the longer term. What about contraindications? They're pretty safe. You don't have to reduce the dose in moderate degrees of renal impairment, hepatic impairment. There's no major contraindication apart from hypersensitivity to the drug than a PCSK9 had taken before. So they're pretty safe. What about outcome data? Well, this was the first study which combines all the patients in the phase 1 and phase 2 studies and extended treatment duration. It randomised them to treatment or no treatment and extended that duration over 4 to 5 years, so a long follow-up. But it's still only, if you look at the figures here, a few thousand patients, so it's not a huge amount. That's 6,000 roughly randomised to placebo or treatment, treated for a long time. And they did pre-specify cardiovascular endpoints, but this is still a pretty small study to tell you about cardiovascular mortality. It's still pretty small, it's pretty underpowered, and adverse effects. Now the key thing, of course, is it reduced your LDL-C levels, massively reduced LDL-C from, these are fancy figures, 2.2% in 7 therapy to 0.9 millimoles per litre, sorry, that's what it should read, with a hazard ratio of 0.57, and it definitely reduced MACE events, but it's not powered to show it. So you need a bigger study. This is just published. This was published last month. 4A study, there's 27,000 patients with documented cardiovascular or vascular disease. So this is the second prevention group that you want to see. They had to have LDL levels above, had to have LDL levels above 1.8. Again, that's well within our normal treatment regimes, on at least a small dose of atorvastatin. They're randomised to treatment or nothing for 2 years. Demographics are interesting because most were previous myocardial infarction, but remote. They'd had them 1 to 3 years before they were included into the study, and the median time is about 3 years. Smaller numbers had ischemic stroke or peripheral arterial disease. So this is a proper secondary prevention population. Cardiovascular risk factors, again, here you see a good proportion of diabetics. This is a population we tend to see in secondary prevention trials. It's a good marker, and this is their baseline lipid levels again. The median level was 2.4. That's where most of our patients sit now. Primary endpoint was death, major cardiovascular events. Secondary endpoint was a composite of cardiovascular stroke or MI. Revascularization and admission for unstable angina were also in here, because in the early studies we did see that high-dose statins reduced those events. These are the outcomes. Definite reduction in cardiovascular events. And if you look carefully, it consists mainly in a reduction in MI rates, stroke, and revascularization. It didn't have an overall effect on mortality, if you take that separately, but it did have an important effect on all of these major components of MACE. And look at this LDL reduction, down to 0.78. That's frighteningly low. We get worried when our patients have LDL-Cs below 1 millimole per litre. We think, we get worried, we reduce the statin. So this tells us that we should be more aggressive. So, to stop and summarise, there's a clear cardiovascular benefit in terms of risk reduction in patients on reasonable doses of statins who have one of these newer agents. There's no signal for adverse risk. The limitation is it's a BD, or twice a month or once a month subcutaneous injection. I think we will see mortality benefit with larger studies. I think that's sort of undeniable, and longer studies a clear cardiac mortality benefit, and then the argument for using it will be even stronger. But it's really expensive. So we have used it very infrequently in the UK. It's $14,000 per year. It's really out of the range of even most Western healthcare systems, so I think in Africa it's a long way off. It's subcutaneous delivery, it's once every couple of weeks, once every 4 weeks. Patients don't like taking tablets, let alone having an injection once every 2 or 4 weeks, for something they can't see a benefit from. So persuading patients to have it will be difficult. It's currently indicated for patients with familial hypercholesterolemia who are not controlled, and that is a different population. They're not the same. They're much more motivated, they know about cholesterol levels, they're much more likely to have a twice weekly or once monthly injection. But your second prevention cohort probably are not. And I think there is a lot of work to do here before it becomes mainstream therapy.
Thank you very much. So let's take a question or two for Jonathan. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you for the good presentation. My question is just related to the raw audio that was quoted in the 4-year study. So does that mean, this prove that we probably don't need to worry much when you get a very low LDL? And like when you get like around 1, actually for us, when you get around 1, we actually now decrease the dose for the statin.
You mean, should you worry about a very low LDL level?
Yeah, should we continue worrying? And also about the cognitive impairment.
Yeah, so the answer is we probably shouldn't worry about the very low LDL level. Now, there is some data in elderly patients showing low LDL levels are an adverse predictor of outcome. But I think take that away from dealing with the second prevention population. I think the lower the LDL, the better. And that's what the newer studies tell us. So don't worry about those LDLs of 1 or below, because that's probably where we should be targeting. Your second question was about neurocognitive. It's just a signal. If you look at the studies, it's self-reported, so it's not objectively documented, but it's around 1.2% in the treatment arm compared to about 0.5% in the non-treatment arm. So it's a very, very soft signal. But it is something that the FDA have asked for ongoing surveillance of over coming years, and that might pan out to something that's relevant. Other questions?
So probably about the other are there other targets probably which the PCSK9 are probably improving on drugs like probably ApoB or lipoprotein?
Yeah, the short answer is I don't know. There haven't been any therapeutic targets for either of those that have shown anything more than experimental promise. This group of agents, I think, is here for the short to medium term. Whether they can change how the drug is delivered is going to dictate how often and how frequently they're used. But this is the sort of paradigm shift for lipid management for the next 10 years. I think we're going to see modifications, genetic modifications other than this in the near future. It's taken 10 to 15 years to get this from experiment to market. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Just a comment. I happened to be in Washington when this was being presented. And at least in the short term, the neurocognitive, whatever effect was not seen despite this very low LDL. But of course, I mean, in the study, the follow-up is 3 years or something, so we don't know what is going to happen in the long term. The other point that came out, in fact, there were 2 presentations. So Sabatini presented the 4-year, and Paul Ridker presented the other one. Like you said, the names are difficult. It's Alarikumab or what have you.
Don't try and say it.
Yes, I didn't know, but then I realized then that not all of them are fully human monoclonal antibodies. This one, which is successful, is a human monoclonal antibody. The other one was a humanized monoclonal antibody. And they thought that that was the problem, so it wasn't as successful. And in fact, the manufacturer, I think Sanofi, has withdrawn it from further trials. So the point there is that it's maybe not as a class effect, there's some heterogeneity in the various PSA minor.
That's a very good point. Yeah.
And then,
Thanks.
Thank you. Introduce Dr. Faraz Badr, is the director of the heart failure clinic in Cleveland Clinic in Abu Dhabi. He will take us through management of heart failure in the period in Fad area.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this wonderful meeting. I feel honored to be included in this esteemed faculty. So I will move you now from the risk factor management stage to a little bit more advanced organ system dysfunction stage. And my job is to kind of discuss with you the updates on heart failure management. We know that heart failure happens in the setting of ischemic or non-ischemic etiologies. Unfortunately, once chronic heart failure develops, the treatment is not different for the most part, as long as you excluded revascularization as a possibility for chronic heart failure patients who present for the first time. So, I'll discuss a little bit the epidemiology of heart failure as we face it right now. Just few slides on pathophysiology. I'll take you through the medical management of heart failure and what's new in it, and maybe reflections on our experience at the Cleveland Clinic in Abu Dhabi. So we all know that patients with heart failure could end up with their condition through multiple different pathways, but we specifically heard about risk factors. And importantly, since we're now in a STEMI meeting, coronary artery disease, once you get the left ventricular injury, you basically stimulate a host of neurohormonal mechanisms to compensate initially for the ventricular dysfunction. But these same neurohormonal mechanisms end up becoming the bad influence in heart failure pathophysiology and lead to the progression of the disease. So we end up with something called pathologic remodeling, which is essentially the change in the heart from being a nice, elliptical, efficient pump to a more spherical, inefficient pump over time. The heart does this so a lower ejection fraction could continue to produce the same cardiac output. We know it's ultimately not about the ejection fraction for the heart. It's about the cardiac output, and it's all physics. So a lower ejection fraction of a bigger heart means a maintained cardiac output for a little bit of time, but because this is not natural, it does not sustain itself over a long time. We end up with lower ejection fraction and ultimately morbidity and mortality. So coronary artery disease is an important etiology for heart failure. We need to work on prevention of reinfarction. These are the treatment goals once people develop acute coronary syndromes or are discovered with chronic coronary artery disease for that matter. We need to prevent progression to heart failure. We need to reduce the risk of arrhythmias in coronary artery disease patients to prevent the progression to heart failure. Of course, we need to prevent LV remodeling using the disease-modifying agents that we know. We now know that about 1 to 2% of the population worldwide have heart failure. I actually think that in our region, in the Middle East, it's a little bit higher than this. I think it's somewhere between 2.5 to 3%, simply because we have a higher prevalence of traditional risk factors, including type 1 diabetes mellitus, which means that people live with these risk factors for a longer period of time before they manifest as heart failure patients. So in my experience, it's a little higher in our region. I want you to distinguish between chronic heart failure and acute heart failure. So acute heart failure is what happens when people decompensate very quickly and require hospitalization. This could be in the setting of acute coronary syndromes, specifically ST elevation, myocardial infarction, or on top of a chronic heart failure diagnosis from before. Chronic heart failure, on the other hand, is the progressive heart failure patients that you follow in your clinics and you try to escalate medications for, and you try to consider later for device therapy. And as they advance longer and longer, you start thinking about advanced therapies in the form of assist devices or heart transplant. I also would like to emphasize the difference between heart failure with reduced ejection fraction and heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. And this is important from a pathophysiologic perspective, but also from a management perspective. Heart failure with reduced ejection fraction is mostly associated with dilatation of the ventricle. This is very important. And this is where evidence-based therapies have been shown to improve morbidity and mortality. And we'll discuss the classes of these medications as we go through the presentation. On the other hand, heart failure with preserved ejection fraction is mostly characterized by hypertrophied ventricles, mostly in the setting of poorly controlled hypertensive patients, and it's a non-dilated ventricle. And as it stands now, we don't have a specific class of medications that has been proved to reduce mortality in these patients. Of course, we can discuss some of that further, but in the guidelines, we don't have anything that could reduce mortality definitively in this class. You're familiar with the NYHA functional class symptom classification. We all use it in our patients, and importantly, this describes the patient as you see them momentarily. A patient could be class 3 or 4 at the time of admission, but you could discharge them from the hospital once you control their volume overload as class 1 or 2. This doesn't describe the progressive nature of the disease. That's why the ACC talked about the ABCD classification of heart failure, which is the progressive description of heart failure. So the patients who we heard about discussing hyperlipidemia or hypertension a little bit earlier ago fall into A, which is patients at risk for heart failure. This is also inclusive of patients with coronary artery disease. B would be the asymptomatic LV dysfunction. C would be symptomatic heart failure. Of course, D would be the advanced refractory end-stage heart failure patients. This is the tip of the iceberg. And we need to do a much better job managing patients at earlier stages so they don't get to the advanced stage, simply because resources are very, very limited in these advanced stages, regardless of what healthcare system you practice in, be it in the Western countries or in the region. So this is the problem with heart failure. It's a progressive disease. And most of the problems that result from heart failure result from recurrent decompensations and admissions. Every time a patient decompensates and gets admitted to the hospital, this is automatically associated with worse prognosis, worse mortality and worse morbidity. And although we think that medications and devices represent the biggest burden in heart failure management, it's actually hospitalizations and long-term care facility costs. So what we need to do is work on keeping patients out of the hospital, optimized enough so they don't decompensate frequently and end up being admitted to the hospital. Let me start with this case very quickly, and we'll continue with the presentation. This is a 52 Asian man with NYHA functional class 2, mostly active, occasional heart failure symptoms, diagnosed 6 months ago. He's a construction supervisor and needs to keep working to save for retirement. He presents to the clinic for a regular routine follow-up appointment, complains of shortness of breath and exertion consistent with NYHA functional class 2 symptoms. His physical exam, normal JVP, no S3, no crackles, no edema, well perfused. So I always like to assess my patients from a volume perspective and also perfusion perspective, because it's important that you look at both these things at the same time. So serum creatinine is normal. For those who are interested, NT-proBNP is 487, and in the past medical history, there's also hypertension, diabetes, and on optimized doses of ACE inhibitors, beta blockers, mineralocorticoid inhibitors, and diuretics. And the reason I said optimized doses because I wanted to see how you guys feel about the concept of optimized doses as we go through the discussion. This seems to be a hugely variable thing among practitioners, and it's becoming totally subjective too. So we talked about remodeling. This is in the setting of acute coronary syndrome. A part of the heart muscle is dead, so the other parts of the heart kind of try to compensate by this pathological process to maintain cardiac output. This is the slide that shows the neurohormonal imbalances in heart failure. So once heart failure develops, there are different neurohormonal systems that are activated. There is the bad neurohormonal systems in the form of sympathetic nervous system and renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, and there are the good neurohormonal systems in the form of natriuretic peptides. Importantly here, it seems that things kind of funnel down in the same pathways. So even the sympathetic nervous system exerts some of its bad effects through activation of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, because we have beta-1 receptors in the juxtaglomerular apparatus in the kidney. So blocking the renin-angiotensin system has played a major role in improving mortality and morbidity in heart failure patients, as you all know. Same thing with beta blockers. The concept of management through improving the natriuretic peptide system has not been addressed for many, many years, or has been, but did not result in the outcomes that we were hoping for. So there's no magic pill. Unfortunately, if there was a magic pill, it would be too hard to swallow. It wouldn't even be an injection in this case. So I will not bore you with data related to basic heart failure therapies, but I would like to remind you that ACE inhibitors for years now represented a mainstay in heart failure management. This is the sole trial for using ACE inhibitors in patients with LV systolic dysfunction, significant mortality reduction here. This is patients who could not be on ACE inhibitors from the VALHEFT study. Angiotensin receptor blockers do the same work like ACE inhibitors when people cannot be on ACE inhibitors. They have a milder benefit when you add them on top of ACE inhibitors, mostly in the direction of hospitalizations. We know that beta blockers improve patients' outcomes. It's very, very important. The Capricorn study, since we're talking about post-myocardial infarction heart failure, was a study dedicated to post-myocardial infarction heart failure patients with carvedilol. And it enrolled patients who were post-MI with LV systolic dysfunction, resulted in significant mortality benefit. I would like to emphasize here that the dose does matter when you're up-titrating patients on heart failure medications. So please do not forget this and assume that this is the maximally tolerated dose without evidence that it is the maximally tolerated dose. This is the MOCA study, and it showed that over time, as you up-titrate patients from the low dose of carvedilol to the higher dose, mortality is reduced, and actually cardiovascular hospitalizations are also reduced in a significant manner. Importantly, I would like to emphasize that according to guidelines, there are many ACE inhibitors approved for the management of heart failure. There are only 3 angiotensin receptor blockers because this is what was studied and evidence-based in heart failure patients. Only 2 mineralocorticoid antagonists. We lost power, it looks like. I can keep going, but I think the display is better this way. And then there is, of course, 3 beta blockers only. It's bisoprolol, carvedilol, or metoprolol succinate, metoprolol long-acting. But that's about it. Other beta blockers officially in the guidelines have not been approved for heart failure management. Of course, hydralazine and hydralazine and nitrates are important when patients cannot be on ACE inhibitors or ARBs. They're also important in African American patients. Beta blockers. One of the practical issues regarding beta blocker use is symptomatic exacerbation. I see many patients taken off of their beta blockers once they come into the hospital because they're in heart failure. Well, I encourage you to not take patients off beta blockers if they're coming in just volume overloaded, because it simply means that you're going to be exposing them to this sympathetic nervous system surge. And pathophysiologically, when you use beta blockers in somebody for a long time, their beta receptors are actually upregulated in the heart. So you remove beta blockers suddenly, and you expose them to a gush of sympathetic nervous system stimulation, which could result in arrhythmias. So I can't tell you how many times I was called to see heart failure patients, and they're suddenly in new AFib simply because somebody stopped their beta blockers in the setting of acute decompensated heart failure. So try to continue that unless they're in cardiogenic shock bad enough to require inotropes. In that case, it's reasonable to stop beta blockers because they need the inotropic support temporarily. Similarly, using beta blockers with concomitant disease. So people sometimes avoid using them in the setting of diabetes. The classic teaching was that patients will not feel the symptoms of hypoglycemia. We should not be using beta blockers and some of the other things. Chronic obstructive lung disease, most of these patients can tolerate beta blockers, most of them. And unless the airway disease is frankly reversible and severe enough, you should be able to use beta blockers, especially cardioselective ones, because the beta-1 receptors are not existent in the bronchial tree. Of course, when you use a beta-selective one at a higher dose, ultimately you also block beta-2 receptors in the bronchial tree, but I can tell you that in 95% of lung disease patients, I'm fine using beta blockers and I have no problems. Same thing with diabetes. Many people ask me about the heart rate. What is adequate beta blockade in heart failure patients? Adequate beta blockade is getting the heart rate between 50 and 60. So if your heart rate is still above 50, don't worry about pushing beta blockers more. And finally, don't worry about up-titrating medications if the blood pressure is lower, as long as patients are asymptomatic. Okay? If patients are asymptomatic, the blood pressure doesn't matter unless, it's a scary number, it's in the 70s. But many of my heart failure clinic patients are actually in the 80s and 90s. They come in and they're functioning at a class 1 to 2 level. So enough said about that. We know that mineralocorticoid inhibitors have been approved in the management of heart failure based initially on the RAL study, and of course then the EPHASIS and the EMPHASIS trials with eplerenone. This is clearly established. Now we come into the natriuretic peptide concept and what people try to do to introduce a new class of medications. Natriuretic peptides are degraded through a system called neprilysin. Neprilysin basically breaks down natriuretic peptides when they bind to the neprilysin receptor, to the natriuretic peptide receptors here. Of course, on this, I need to mention that we have A, B, and C. Natriuretic peptide, atrial and B-type natriuretic peptides are generated or produced in the heart. C is generated in the endothelial cells. They ultimately bind to the natriuretic peptide receptors and get degraded here. Now, neprilysin is another method of degrading natriuretic peptides. Importantly, people started thinking about blocking neprilysin, so they keep natriuretic peptides in the system a little bit longer if we know that they have these beneficial effects. When they did this, they realized that neprilysin also breaks down angiotensin II. And I have mentioned to you before that angiotensin II is a bad end result of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So when they inhibited neprilysin alone, not only did they increase natriuretic peptides, but they also increased angiotensin II. So the outcomes were not exactly what we wanted them to be. And that's why they thought of the next step. Instead of just using a neprilysin inhibitor, maybe use a neprilysin inhibitor and combine it with an angiotensin receptor blocker to block the angiotensin II. And this is the ARNI concept, angiotensin receptor blocker neprilysin inhibitor concept. So it works on both of these ends, keeping more natriuretic peptides in the system, but also blocking angiotensin II in the process. And without going into the historic development of this combination as far as clinical studies are concerned, I would like to just highlight the Paradigm heart failure study. This was the largest heart failure study to date. It's 8,442 patients, and it basically randomized people to this new combination versus a respectable high dose of enalapril. And to do this, they enrolled patients with an EF of less than 40% and did something smart. They did a run-in phase in the study. So they made sure people actually tolerate the enalapril 10 milligram twice a day, and then they made sure that they can tolerate the combination at 100 twice a day and then at 200 twice a day. After they did this run-in phase and felt that certain patients could tolerate either one of these regimens, they randomized them to either the combination or the enalapril 10 milligrams twice a day, and they followed them. Followed them for a median follow-up of 27 months. And all I can tell you is that the outcomes were remarkably positive from this study. This is the combination of death from cardiovascular causes or first hospitalizations for heart failure. This is the composite endpoint, and it was reduced by 20%. So the components of the primary endpoint, death from cardiovascular causes, hazard ratio of 20%, and then 21% for first hospitalization to heart failure. So in the newest guidelines now, this is the European guidelines, sacubitril/valsartan, sacubitril is the neprilysin inhibitor, valsartan combination is recommended to replace ACE inhibitors to further reduce the risk of heart failure, hospitalizations, and death in patients who are class 2, 3, or 4. Let me emphasize though that in the study, most of the patients were class 2 or 3. Very few were class 4 patients. And of course, the level of evidence is B because it was this one huge randomized study. Interestingly, one of the findings from the study were the reduction in sudden death. So the European guidelines actually went as far as recommending the combination to reduce the risk of sudden death in patients with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, which was impressive that they take this bold step. So now we have what we call the disease-modifying therapies in heart failure with reduced EF. We used to have ACEs, beta blockers, ARBs, mineralocorticoid antagonists, and now we have ARNI as the new class in heart failure. This is the first time we have a new class in heart failure management in more than a decade. As far as the updated guidelines from the United States, the same thing. They actually said it could replace ACEs or ARBs for heart failure management in class 2, 3, or 4 patients. And it seems that we'll be seeing more and more studies utilizing these agents in different types of heart failure as well. I'll share with you some of the experience that we had in starting patients on this medication. This is data on the first 60 patients that we used the combination for, and we actually submitted this to the European Heart Failure Meeting. We'll be presenting it at the end of the month. But in this case, we developed a protocol for utilizing Entresto in patients with heart failure and reduced ejection fraction, and that protocol is based on the criteria for enrollment in the study. We wanted patients to have an EF less than 40% and YHA functional class 2 or 4, on stable doses of ACEs or ARBs, and with a blood pressure of more than 100 systolic. This is what we preferred. We cautioned ourselves if it's 90 to 100, or if the patient had moderate liver dysfunction, and we avoided it if the blood pressure is less than 90 with recent symptomatic hypertension, and if there are significant renal or liver disease. So in this case, we put together criteria actually for switching patients depending on what they're on, ACEs or ARBs, and depending on the dose that they're on, we would switch them to the starting dose for the combination. So if they're on a lower dose of ACEs or ARBs, we will put them on the 50 twice a day of the new medication. If they're on the higher dose, we put them on 100 twice a day, and then up titrate to 200 a few weeks later. We also checked their chemistries and renal function at baseline and with up titrations. So this was a retrospective review, and in this case, 61% of patients were identified as patients who were started on the medication. What we wanted to know, because this was restricted to cardiology, what we wanted to know is, outside the heart failure program, did people follow appropriate criteria in starting the medication or not, based on the protocols that we developed. And there were actually 48 patients who were appropriately initiated. 90% were on ACEs or ARBs before. So you would think that if they followed our protocol, 100% of patients should be on ACEs or ARBs. That was 90%. A few patients here and there were started kind of off-label on the medication because of the personal belief from the physician starting them that they can go ahead directly on the medication. Only 41 patients, or 76%, were switched to the appropriate starting dose, because we also gave them guidelines on what dose to switch to. So that was followed most of the time, but not 100% of the time. So 4 patients experienced adverse drug reaction. And this is what we cared about, is how well tolerated the medication was, and it was very well tolerated. Importantly, at the end of the follow-up period, which is not long, it's about 3 months, only 1 patient got readmitted to the hospital out of the 61 patients. So we felt that patients are doing very, very well on it from a clinical perspective. This is just to show you some baseline characteristics. Systolic blood pressure, more than 100, was present in 95% of the patients who were started, ACEs or ARBs in 90%. Target doses of ACEs or ARBs is 31%. Remember, I did emphasize target doses of beta blockers, but in ACEs or ARBs, there's actually no such thing as target dose. Okay? There's a good dose of ACE inhibitors. The target dose of ACE or ARB is the best, the maximally tolerated dose. Okay? There were studies that looked at low versus high doses of ACE inhibitors, and the benefit was on hospitalizations, not mortality. But in beta blockers, it's different. You have to try to get them to a specific target dose. So importantly, as I said, appropriateness was present in most cases, and appropriate switching dose was also present in most cases, but we would like to see it in all cases. So it was prescribed for the appropriate indication in most cases, and again, our readmission rate to the hospital was lower than what we saw in the Paradigm Heart Failure study, except that the Paradigm Heart Failure study followed patients for 27 months, and we followed them for a short period of time. So the key thing in managing heart failure patients is optimism and patience, okay? So if you look at this picture, depending on how you see it, some people will see it like a... How many people, what do you guys see here? How many people see this as an old lady? Okay, this is an optimistic crowd, okay? So when you flip the picture, it looks like a younger lady. So you have to be patient and you have to be optimistic as far as managing your heart failure patients, and kind of continue to up-titrate, continue to educate in your clinic, continue to follow up at appropriate intervals to prevent these readmissions to the hospital, and that will improve outcomes for patients overall. So heart failure is very prevalent and very deadly. Heart failure is very costly, mostly due to hospitalizations. It's a complex clinical syndrome. It has a complex systemic pathophysiology based on neurohormonal imbalance. It requires early diagnosis and management. Medical therapy is based on neurohormonal blockade. This is very important to remember. Heart failure requires multidisciplinary approach to implement guideline-directed medical therapy as perfectly as possible. Resources to treat advanced heart failure are limited. Thank you.
I will have time for one question. I know you're eager to go for... No question? Yeah.
Maybe we have talked generally on the heart failure, probably with reduced ejection fraction, because that's where the evidence is. But what is the approach in heart failure with some ejection fraction?
Approach?
Yeah, on heart failure.
Right now, the only thing I can tell you with certainty about heart failure preserved ejection fraction is very good control of the blood pressure and prevention of volume overload. Very briefly, the TopCat study looked at spironolactone and heart failure patients with preserved ejection fraction. The overall outcome was not different, but there's a lot of discussion happening regarding this study, because apparently when they analyzed the data, all patients, except the patients who were enrolled from Russia and Georgia, benefited significantly, but patients from Russia and Georgia did not benefit at all. So the overall results were neutral. And now the investigators in the Western countries are very mad about this, and they keep analyzing the data over and over and over again.
Very good. I think like these speakers are invited to speak because they are good at what they do, and the effort they put in their presentation is quite evident. We all benefited from that. Please give them a round of applause.
Thank you, Dr. Awad, for facilitating this presentation. We can now proceed down to the restaurant for lunch. Note that